Good morning, Dr. Frank. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us a
So,
little bit about yourself?
I'm a professor of rhetoric at the University of Oregon. I directed our forensics program for many years. I also served a 5-year term as a dean, and I've dedicated my life as a scholar to the study of rhetoric and argumentation with the focus on the rhetorical theories of Chaim Perlman and Lucy Olbrecht-Teka. I've also written books and articles on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I teach courses on argumentation and persuasion and rhetorical theory, rhetorical history.
Awesome. Well, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the study of rhetoric and argumentation?
My mother, who grew up in Dodge City, Kansas, was the timekeeper for the Dodge City High School debate team. And the debate team that she timed for won the state championship. And so I grew up with someone who knew about intercollegiate and high school debate. And so when I was a junior in high school, she encouraged me to join the debate team. And I grew up in Salem, Oregon. And at that time, the director of debate at South Salem High School, where I attended, was Robert Withicum. Withicum went on to be a professor at Whitman College, where he coached many, many national champions. And I remember very clearly during the first day of class, Mr. Withicum saying, we are going to debate, resolve that the jury system should be significantly changed. And he explained that in debates that you are required to debate both sides of the question. And a light just exploded for me because I hadn't really understood the advantages and possibilities of arguing both sides of a question until that time. And then I just fell passionately in love with debate. And so I debated that year, my junior year, and then I debated 4 years. I debated my senior year in high school, and then 4 years at Western Washington University in NDT, or policy debate. And so I fell in love with argumentation and debate. And then at that time, if you were in debate, you would often take coursework in American Public Address. And so I took coursework in American Public Address, and then small group communication, interpersonal communication. And then I decided to go to graduate school in speech and rhetoric. And then my professor advisor in my master's program, Larry Richardson in Western Washington, told me I had two choices to study: either Kenneth Burke, who was a famous rhetorical critic from America, or Chaim Perlman, who was a very famous rhetorical critic from Belgium. So I chose to study Chaim Perlman, and as a good debater in 1979, when I was working on my master's degree, I read everything I could in English on Chaim Perlman. And then I would say fell in love, but I really was intellectually intrigued by the system that Perlman set up, which was congruent with the debate experience that I had had. And so I wrote my dissertation on the Camp David Accords, which then involved an Israeli, an American, and an Egyptian coming together to try to figure out how to deal with the Israeli-Egyptian conflict. So I studied the rhetoric that unfolded during the 13 days that they took at Camp David to figure out how to deal with the Egyptian-Israeli conflict. And from there, then I've spent my career writing about and thinking about argumentation, rhetorical theory, rhetorical history. And so I've also written quite a bit about civil rights and the rhetoric of Barack Obama. And I have a forthcoming article in the journal Rhetoric and Public Affairs that is a critique of rhetorical pessimism, because I see that as a significant problem in our field, the assumption that people who are racist will always be racist, or the assumption that there is something about America that will never yield, that the racism that America was founded upon will never yield to rhetoric and persuasion. And so the article that is forthcoming critiques racial pessimism. So that's where I am.
So I have a couple questions. So the first one, you said you mentioned you went to Western Washington. Did you happen to be a contemporary with my predecessor, Dr. Michael Barton?
Yes, he was my debate coach. So
Oh,
I,
okay.
and I have written books together and articles together, and we were very close friends. Yes.
It all makes sense now.
Yeah.
Oh, I bet he was a great coach. He was an amazing mentor. I think you froze.
Okay, I lost you.
I said, I bet he was a great coach. He was a great mentor.
Oh, he's a great mentor. And again, another reason why I'm in the field is because he was my debate coach, and then he wrote a master's thesis at Western Washington University, and he looked at the Watergate hearings, and he divided at that time the rhetorical situation framework advanced by Lloyd Bitzer was quite popular, as it remains. And he looked at defined rhetorical situations and undefined rhetorical situations. And I thought that was a real good way of, at a foundational level, explaining how rhetoric works. There are many rhetorical situations where we know what to say, we know what the rules are, and that there are others in which we need to improvise and try to invent new ways of doing things. And that was the gist of his master's thesis that continues to inform the way that I look at rhetorical theory.
That's great. And where did you do your PhD?
University of Oregon.
Oh, okay. They had a comm program?
Yes, they did, and they closed it in University closed it in 1991 when the taxpayers decided to limit the amount of money that they would pay for property tax, and so it was a bad moment in the history of our university.
That's interesting because you would think that, the history of communication departments for students listening and watching is actually to fight communist propaganda.
Yeah.
And you'd think that a big state school like the University of Oregon would have a place to fight communist propaganda.
Well, yeah, yeah. We could talk for hours about that, but
Yeah. Another day over perhaps a frosty beverage.
that'd be good.
So that's interesting. And the last question is that the rhetorical pessimism response, is that coming in the upcoming issue of Rhetorical and Public Affairs, that special edition?
Yeah, rhetoric and public affairs. Yes.
Oh, I want to read that. We should, again, a topic for frosty beverages after the interview.
Sounds good.
So, getting back on the topic, what do you believe that argumentation offers society?
Argumentation offers society and individuals ways of disagreeing while using reason rather than violence or avoiding conflict. And it allows us to deploy all the resources that the human being has to be able to deal with the issues and the problems that we face.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more about this distinction between reason and violence? Because I think this is a really interesting distinction that you're making, and it might actually tie into your pessimism argument that you're making above.
Well, I wrote my dissertation on the rhetoric of nonviolent action.
Yeah.
And the argument that I made in the dissertation is that rhetoric is distinguished by its commitment to nonviolence and to persuasion, and that nonviolence and persuasion are essentially moral capacities that we draw on to be able to deal with a human community that is in turn tied to value pluralism. And so you and I are different human beings. We may have different values. At the same time, we may be able to agree on some assumptions, and we may also agree to disagree on some values and assumptions. And so rhetoric is the art and the science that allows us as human beings that hold different perceptions and values to engage in discussion and dialogue, argumentation and debate to determine how we can continue to live with one another in a moral capacity. I root my view of argumentation in morality because the Ohlingers, who were researchers back in the 70s, interviewed people who rescued Jews during World War II and interviewed people who did not choose to rescue Jews. And they found that people who rescued Jews tended to come from families that encouraged discussion and dialogue and debate and argumentation. And they discovered as well that there was something moral that was activated by the existence in a family of dealing with disagreement through argumentation and debate. Families in which corporal punishment was prevalent or in which conflict was avoided, those children did not grow up to rescue Jews. And so there's a lot of research out there that suggests that the process of argumentation and debate can activate a moral concern for the other. And so I have raised with my wife two sons that I'm quite proud of, and I'm proud of them because they are moral human beings. And we raised them with the expectation that they could disagree with us, but the disagreement needed to be enacted and expressed through reasoned discussion and reasoned argumentation. And so about age 8 or 9, both boys were then able to engage us as parents in the kinds of dialogue that allowed us to reason together.
Yeah. Well, if I'm hearing you right, and I think this is absolutely true, this is sort of by learning the other side's perspective, you're at least acknowledging that they might have merit. And so you create space for them to exist, right? And one of these words you're using, a pluralism, acknowledges that there's lots of different people that exist with lots of different faiths and beliefs, and they're not just going to go away, right? We need to acknowledge that lots of difference exists. And so how do we all coexist?
And that's exactly right. And I believe that we do not resolve conflicts. That's a naive assumption. We can manage them, and there may be moments in which we just acknowledge that our value systems are different and that we need to coexist. And so argumentation is not designed to resolve disagreement or obliterate conflict or to solve a problem. Argumentation allows us to explore our realities, and it is based upon the assumption that we should be humble about what we know, and we should be quick to acknowledge when we're wrong. And so there's an embedded humility in argumentation. And Henry W. Johnstone and Perlman and a host of others in the 50s and 60s saw argumentation as a way of correcting mistakes, and that we should, when we engage in argumentation, be ready to concede a point and to acknowledge that what our opponent may be presenting may be stronger than the perception that we hold. So the aspiration that we try to teach to students of being able to argue the other side is not one that we encourage because we simply want to figure out how to beat the opponent. We want to learn what we may be not, what we are not seeing in the point of view that others are expressing. We're looking at the other point of view to engage in the introspection that we need to correct our misperceptions.
Right. And this comes from debate. In the design of debate, it's usually the competitive lure that encourages you to more thoroughly explore the other side.
And that competitive lure can sometimes, as we've talked about before, become toxic, because then the goal is simply to learn the other side in order to vanquish the other side. And right. The best and the most noble form of argumentation involves substantial risk that people take, because if you and I argue and we are arguing in the proper manner, I am risking my worldview. You may be able to persuade me with good reason that my point of view is limited, or my values are not coherent, or that my actions are not just.
Right, exactly. So what would you call this perspective of argumentation?
A rhetorical perspective on argumentation, because it is a perspective that takes into account time and place and audience. And so argumentation takes place in time, especially oral communication. So it is unfolding. We cannot be bound to rules or laws, although the rules and laws that of reason can offer us banisters that we can deploy in order to make good decisions. And so If we are building a bridge and we have two engineers, there are tools of measurement that we ought to be able to use to determine what we ought to do. We are facing a pandemic, and we have a president that has to this point refused to listen to the scientists. And so we would default to the scientists and to models to be able to battle the coronavirus. And then the scientists are debating among themselves which model, the University of Washington model or the Johns Hopkins model or the King's College model, is the best one to deploy. So there's argumentation that takes place in science. And then there is the important role argumentation plays in, for example, marriages, because Gottman and others at the University of Washington have discovered that people who stay married are those that are equipped with the capacity to argue about their differences of opinion. And so that's another contribution that argumentation plays. But it's a deeply and profoundly rhetorical activity that embraces the moment, the people, and the time. It's not rule bound, it is rule guided, and it is an activity, it's an art, it's a science that allows us to achieve communion and also to remain, as we should on occasion, in disagreement about core values.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could unpack some of these ideas for us based on your work with Perlman and Ulbricht's Titeka for a little bit. Would you mind doing that?
Sure, yes. So Chaim Perlman was a Jew who emigrated from Poland and then became a citizen of the state of Belgium. And he was a professor at the Free University. He had advanced degrees in both law and philosophy. He was the leader of the Jewish underground during World War II. And after the war, he was in search of a philosophical system that he thought could help rebuild civil society in Belgium and in Europe. And so about 1947, he met Lucy Olbrechts-Titeka, and he and Lucy Olbrechts-Titeka then embarked on a 10-year project between 1947 and 1958 to rediscover the sources of reasonability. And at that time in 1947, they rediscovered the rhetorical tradition and the works of Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and others who had written about rhetorical theory. And so what they did in that 10-year project was to look for a theory of rhetoric that would bring into what they called rapprochement, persuasion, and reason. And so their project, which they called the New Rhetoric Project, brings reason, as we understand it, a non-formal form of logic, into coordination with the capacity to persuade. And they intertwined the two, saying that the two were not separate, but that they needed to be bound together. And so in 1958, they published a very long treatise that they titled The New Rhetoric, a treatise on argumentation, which was then translated into English in 1969. And so their work, Perlman and Olbrechts-Titeka's work, and the work of Kenneth Burke have been, those are the two primary works of rhetoric in the 20th century, along with Stephen Toulmin's work, which is not really rhetorical, but Toulmin does offer a view of logic that is non-formal. And so Perlman's work comes out of the horrors of the Holocaust, because he left, Belgium was invaded by the Nazis in May of 1940, and on September 7th, 1944, the Nazis left Belgium, and Perlman was still employed by the Free University of Brussels. And so he was, in the wake of the war, a philosopher looking for a way to reconstruct society, and the New Rhetoric Project was his answer.
Yeah. So what were some of the tools that he used to entwine rhetoric and informal logic? Can you give us a sense of some of those?
So, yes, the first assumption is that we live in a world of irreducible sociological pluralism. And that means that Perlman, was a Jew. He was a Jew in a system that favored Christianity. And so there were those in Belgium who said that a Jew in Belgium could not be a loyal citizen. And so he argued that, yes, you could be both a Jew and a citizen of Belgium. You could be faithful to both Belgium and to the Jewish culture and Jewish faith at the same time. And so there are those who would say, no, you can only be loyal to your Jewish heritage. And if you were loyal to your Jewish heritage, you wouldn't be a loyal citizen of Belgium, because you, as a Jew, would always be loyal to the state of Israel after 1948. And he argued, Perlman did in a series of writings, and he's a proud Jew. You could be a Jew and you could also be a Belgian. So he imported that set of expectations into his philosophical writings by arguing that, yes, human beings can hold multiple values. Sometimes those values are in conflict, but they must be in a sense, in nested opposition rather than being mutually exclusive. And so that was the foundational assumption that he began with as a sociology. And then, philosophically too, he was a pluralist, because he believed that there were many expressions of knowledge. There could be musical knowledge, there could be scientific knowledge, there could be psychological knowledge, and all those expressions of knowledge were in their own fields, but sometimes they did overlap. And then he saw that there was a need for a non-formal expression of logic and reason. And although he did believe in the logical positivist view of the need for the law of non-contradiction, he modified that law because he saw that it could be applied in a ruthless manner, which is what the Nazis did. And so he believed that the law of non-contradiction, for example, should be applied situationally and conditionally. So when two values were in conflict, you didn't need to choose between the two. You could, in fact, just nest the two in a civic culture. So you could be a Jew and you could be a Belgian at the same time. They didn't need to be mutually exclusive. So then what do you do when people disagree? And his answer was persuasion. And so if we disagree, we then turn to persuasion, which is not something separate from non-formal logic. It is integral to the logic that you are trying to employ because it's non-formal. So by using rhetoric, you are learning about the other person, your audience that you're trying to persuade, and you may learn something about your audience that causes you to modify what you believe and also to modify the logic that you are using. So it's an embedded logic, it's a situational logic that is reflexive. So if I learn more about you, Justin, and I'm trying to persuade you that gun control is a bad idea, and that if you try to take my gun, then I'll be defenseless, then I need to be able to learn, I might learn something from you that might modify the way that I think about gun control. It may modify the way that I argue, but most important, there is a logic of freedom. So I am giving you the option of listening to and responding to my argument, and you can agree with it or disagree with it, but there is embedded in the logic the assumption that you are a free human being, and then I'm not just going to give you a syllogism that you must adopt, because if you don't, then you're not a logical human being. So this is a very different way of going about dealing with other human beings.
Yeah, so the assumption is that if you don't accept it, that's okay, right? You doesn't mean you're stupid, it just means you don't agree with me.
But if I truly believe that the Johns Hopkins model is stronger than the University of Washington model on the COVID-19 issue, I'm going to try to marshal all the arguments that I can to try to persuade you and try to adapt to you and try to bring you gently to the conclusion that I've reached. It is not, I'm not assuming a relativist perspective. I think you're wrong, Justin. If you're not going to wear a mask, I think you're wrong. And I'm going to do everything that I can to persuade you. I'm not going to shoot you. I'm not going to use violence against you. I'm going to try to figure out, all, like Lacan says, that we have to wring the neck of rhetoric. to be able to persuade the other person. So the more I know about you and the more that we are able to form a community, the better I will be able to persuade you. And so there is a deep and embedded logic to this art of persuasion. And far too often, going back to Peter Ramus, people, philosophers and others had divided rhetoric from reason. And that's what Promenade Brextiteka did. They reintegrated the two.
Yeah, form from content, etc., right? Like as if they were different. And it seems to be what you're suggesting is that then what they do is they sort of systematize a number of different strategies. Let's say I'm trying to persuade you to wear a mask. I might think about what values we have in common, right? Say you are a fan of, public health. I might appeal to your knowledge of public health, or I might appeal to your fashion sense and say that this is a great opportunity for you to bedazzle something new.
And in your case, I would say, well, Justin, you're a dog owner. If you fall ill, you will not be able to take care of your 18-month-old dog. And then you're also a husband. So if you fall ill, you'll not be able to enjoy the benefits of being married to a wonderful woman. And you're also a professor at Pacific Lutheran University. Who will teach your courses if you fall ill? And then I can say, look at other people in your same role. You are a practicing Christian. I know that the minister in your church is advocating that you wear a mask. So I'm going to do everything that I can.
Proud Jew.
About you. Yeah, they're Fauci. That's right.
No, so, proud Jew.
Or proud Jew. You're a proud Jew too. Look at, Benjamin Netanyahu is wearing a mask. And you're a Seattle Mariners fan. Well, do you want to ever go back to watch the Mariners again and drink a cold one? Then you better wear a mask. So, I'll appeal to your self-interest. I'll do everything that I can, understanding who you are and the roles that you play, to adapt the arguments and the reasons that I have to you.
So how do you identify an argument then in the wild?
How do I identify an argument in the wild?
Yeah, so let's say you're putting on your critic hat now.
And how do I critique arguments?
Yeah, like putting on your critic hat, how do you identify an argument?
Well, I do rely upon the distinction that Kahneman and others make between system one and system two thinking. So system one thinking is fast, it's intuitive, it's often impulsive, it's often ruled by emotion, but it can serve us well in many situations. There's also system two reasoning, which is slower and methodical and is often lazy. And so system two reasoning is often scientific. It requires validation, and it requires a slow, more deliberative process. And so in critiquing arguments, I have to keep in mind that those two systems of reasoning and thinking are often on display. And so when people are angry, when people are rushing to judgment, when people have not slowed things down, they often make mistakes. Not always, but they often make mistakes. And so slowing things down can often bring about the capacities of system two thinking to check system one thinking. So for example, David Sanger in the New York Times has an article out analyzing how Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, who are the two people advising President Trump about the COVID-19 crisis, have dealt with these issues. And Dr. Birx loves the University of Washington model because it is, at least at one time, the most optimistic model. And the model assumed that we would all be wearing masks, that we would all be engaging in significant social distancing. And Dr. Fauci was quite suspicious about those assumptions. But because President Trump wanted good news and wanted to be able to say to the country that the virus was going to eventually disappear, Dr. Birx gave him the University of Washington model as the one that she thought the country should use. And as a result, she's giving into system one thinking because she enjoys the privileges of having an office in the White House and in giving advice to the most powerful person in the country. And so she's been brought into the fold in the White House, and Dr. Fauci is often off doing his own work and is not in conversation with the president. So,
Getting hit piece was written about him.
I'm sorry?
Didn't you see there was a number of hit pieces? Or there was a hit piece written about him.
About Fauci?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right. No, that's good. That's true. Yeah.
So again, when I think about argument or as a critic, I begin with that assumption, the assumption that there are two modes of thinking. One is fast, system one is slow, system two, and we need to bring the two into concert in whatever manner that we can.
Yeah. And is there any way you go about analyzing or reconstructing it?
Well, I, for example, have analyzed the rhetoric of Barack Obama, and so when he gave his race speech in 2008, he was really facing a very complex context because he was trying to speak to both a white audience and a black audience at the same time, and he was trying to cross over the color line. And so in an article that I wrote about that speech, the More Perfect Union speech, I argued that he accomplished that goal because he was able to understand the point of view of both the black audience and the white audience. And then at the end of the speech, he called for mutual recognition and empathy. And I think that's something that's quite possible in this country, as the recent protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, have illustrated that it is possible for whites, progressive whites, to understand and to empathize with the structural racism and the 400 years of slavery suffered by black citizens in this country. And so again, I would give as an illustration of an argument that I have analyzed and that I thought was a successful effort to bridge the racial divide.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good example. How would you go about assessing the strength of an argument? What standards do you or does your system use?
Well, a rhetorical system would, again, draw upon both system one and system two thinking.
Yeah.
And system two thinking then is applied in certain contexts. And so if we are arguing about which model we should use to assess the trajectory of the COVID-19 virus, then we would employ the standards used in medical science. And so if you are presenting evidence to a president on the strengths and weaknesses of the Johns Hopkins, the University of Washington, and the King's College models, then you would work very hard to provide the president with the information the president needed to have under his or her command on the assumptions of each of the models and which model might be the best one to work with. If you are arguing with your wife, then you would need to be very careful to blend system one and system two thinking. And so there are reasons that the heart has that need to be explored and on occasion interrogated. And so marriages that last the longest are the result of partners being able to use their disagreements as a vehicle to elicit arguments that allow the partners to better understand one another and also to solve problems together. And again, most arguments in marriages are serial. You don't solve them, you manage them, and then you use argumentation to deal with those serial arguments in a way that allows the relationship to remain in place.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm hearing you say in this distinction between system one and system two is that they actually operate in these different sort of, I'm going to use the language of spheres, right? Or fields, or can we unpack that a little bit more? It seems like you're drawing out that there are these different places or distinctions between areas, right? I'm hearing one of science, I'm hearing one in the family or the private. Is there one for public?
Yeah, so it really calls on us to develop a real robust sense of what reason is. Mm-hmm. And our friends from the Netherlands reduce argumentation to a set of rules, which really in their system morphs into a set of immutable laws. And so if you violate one of those rules, you have committed a fallacy. And certainly that is true in some contexts, in some situations, but that approach should not rule our understanding of argumentation and rhetoric. My assumption is that system one and system two of thinking constitute the anchors and the touchstones for a very broad vision of what constitutes the ability of the human being to reason. And so system one thinking often calls upon us to deal immediately with the issues that we face. It also calls upon us to have or to make use of a proper expression of emotions. And so on occasion, anger may be a justified response. On occasion, apathy might be an appropriate response. And so again, we need to be able to understand the logic of emotion. And there is a logic of emotion because emotions play an important role in human affairs. There are also moments in which we are trying to construct a bridge or to choose the best model to predict the trajectory of a pandemic, in which we default to more of a system two approach. And we would then ask medical scientists for advice on what we should do about a pandemic. And we would turn to engineers to help us to structure a blueprint designed to help us to build a bridge over a river. And so both systems, system one and system two, belong in the realm of reason and logic and our ability to persuade.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It makes a lot of sense. I'm always sort of struck by the thought of, I don't know if you've ever read Descartes' Error. Descartes' Error.
Yeah.
Right, and there's this section of the guy that can't choose cereal. And for the people watching, it's this guy who's missing part of his brain that has emotion. So he's just like pure logic. And as a result, he has this inability to choose what cereal he wants because there's an infinite number of logical reasons to choose between Cheerios and Rice Krispies. One's cheaper, but one has more calories, and we need some form of emotional pull ultimately to make some decision, right? So there's no such thing as pure logic to help.
Right, and we are impure thinkers. Our logics are impure. Our logics are results of human activity. And so that was one of the points that Perlman and others were making in the 1950s, because we can't default to mathematical or geometrical logic. Those are fantasies. Those are creations that are useful maybe if you are an abstract mathematician. But when you're dealing with human affairs, those systems of logic should be there to assist but not rule us.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So can you give us maybe another example of how you might use your approach to argumentation to understand a contemporary example?
Well, I would again draw on race relations, because the assumption that some people have reached is that many people are beyond the realm or are beyond the capacity of changing their opinions about race. And so racial pessimists and Afro-pessimists hold the position that America has been, is, and always will be a racist country. And so I believe, having studied the rhetoric of anti-racism, that racism and anti-racism will continue to duel in both the history and the present and the future of America. And that there are moments, especially during the civil rights era in the 1960s, that the anti-racist argumentation won the day. And so Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963, in the March on Washington speech, displayed a theory of how America could change in a pragmatic way. And so in the aftermath of the march, Congress passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlawed legal segregation. It passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which gave Blacks in Mississippi and all the other southern states significant voting rights. And then Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty, which reduced poverty in America for both whites and blacks. And then in 1968, the Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. And all those acts together made a significant difference in the everyday lives of African Americans. And so when I study argumentation and I want to point to successful moments, I would point to the 1960s because there was a significant decrease in racism and in the ability of the American Congress to pass legislation that changed the day-to-day lives of many people in the South and the North.
No, I think that's a really good example. Is that the one? Is that sort of the argument you were going to make in Rhetoric and Public Affairs?
Yes.
I'll
And
be interested to see sort of what the community's response is. I like that argument.
well, I don't think many people will because there are a number of racial pessimists in our field, both white and black, who believe that the election of Donald Trump is just a capstone on the argument that they're making that America has been, is, and always will be racist. And I end the article by pointing out that the Black Lives Matter protests have been the most significant protests in the history of this country, and that white Americans have, as a result of witnessing the murder of George Floyd, changed their opinions about structural racism and 400 years of slavery. And Tinashe Coates has even agreed that this is a moment of what he calls optimism. I don't know, I'm not optimistic. I think that the moment has unleashed significant possibilities. I'm also encouraged by our students. I'm sure your students at PLU and my students at the University of Oregon are in alignment with the values of the Black Lives Matters movement.
Yeah.
Have moved significantly on issues of gender and race.
Yeah.
And so, I'm quite encouraged by the Z generation, the millennial generation, and also white progressives who are my age, who are, figuring out a way to learn a new language about race and how to translate their feelings about racial injustice into words and actions that can make for a more just society.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think that what we have in this particular moment, I think we are in a very unique moment in history, right? Intensified by the pandemic, so I mean, my training as a media scholar can't help but think about the way that all the filming and the unique ways that we're sensing racial injustice create the conditions for some form of transformation, right? Like if you think about the civil rights era, a lot of the nonviolence is tied to techniques of visualization, right? The entire point of the protest is so others can see the regimes of violence performed on those bodies. And now, based on the spectacle, right? And now the ability to capture the spectacle of the violence is everywhere in your pocket, right? And it's just more and more salient and more ubiquitous. And now it's filmed in color and disseminated, and it's going around and narrated. Like I don't just, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Again, another for a frosty beverage.
Well, and you talk about visualization. John Lewis passed recently, and we know that he wore a white trench coat as he was marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge because he was anticipating that blood would be shed, and he wanted to make sure that if blood was shed, that it would be caught on TV, which it was. And so the 1965 Voting Rights Act can be traced almost directly to the blood that was spilled on his white trench coat. And he was an amazing human being that I can't fully grasp or understand because he believed in the concept of redemptive suffering. He really believed that if people suffered in the face of injustice, that then attitude change would follow. And that when the person who was beating him, he would not look at the human being that was beating him as a monster, but he tried to visualize that person as a young boy or a young child before that young child had learned about how to think as a racist. And jumping from the cruelty that he must have seen in the eyes of that police officer that was beating him to imagining that person as a young boy before he learned how to be a racist, that's something I don't think I could do. That's
Yeah.
almost, it's otherworldly, but it also becomes persuasive because it became a spectacle, and a spectacle can be framed in a good way, which it was, because many white Americans were repulsed by the image, and Lyndon Baines Johnson had many flaws, but one of his virtues was the ability to empathize with poor people and the suffering engaged that blacks had engaged in or had been inflicted upon them for years. And so, anyway, that's a illustration, and then the Floyd murder too.
Yeah, I mean, what you see is then it's narrated and contextualized, and all of a sudden and we see it so often, right? I mean, that's the thing. Those images now, which have been happening and not really been filmed, when you have the proliferation of our media ecology, it just, so I think all of these moments are coalescing. I think it is fascinating, and they provide ordinary people the ability, a lot of power.
Yes.
Yeah. I know before the interview you said you wanted to talk about the gun control debate a little bit. I figured I'd provide you that opportunity now since it didn't naturally come up.
But I wanted to talk with you about your wonderful article that you wrote with a colleague that looks at the gun control debate
Sure.
and use of strategic maneuvering, which is a perspective offered by our colleagues from Europe. And at the end of that article, you and your colleague, and you look at the way Wayne LaPierre, who is I don't think he's the head anymore, is he?
I actually don't know. I haven't been following the NRA as much for my own sanity.
I don't know if he's still president, but anyway, when Barack Obama was president of the United States, Wayne LaPierre was the president of the NRA, and Barack Obama was an advocate for gun control. And in your article, you look at the manner in which they used strategic maneuvering to engage in an argument about gun control. And in the first half of the article, you note that neither Obama nor LaPierre really tried to enter into the worldview of their opponent. And you found that to be dysfunctional because the
Yeah.
argument really wasn't joined. And at the end of the article, you make an argument which I found quite persuasive, that to truly have a good civil argument, that both advocates, LaPierre and Obama, needed to be able to make use of the starting points of their opponents. And so, in my judgment, the end of the article really nailed it, and it confirms what I already believe, which is often the case, that the new rhetoric that is offered by Perlman and Obrecht-Stuteka is really the best way to go about cultivating an environment that will elicit the best kinds of argument, because the new rhetoric offers people who disagree the opportunity to take a risk, and they take a risk because they are humble about their assumptions and they are searching for the best arguments that they can offer to persuade an audience. Now, Wayne LaPierre, I don't think, is truly open to different arguments about his position. I think, and you've written about this, I believe, about Obama's pragmatism.
Mm-hmm.
And you argue in an article that Obama was pragmatic. And if you're really pragmatic, you don't begin and stay with one starting point, which is the requirement that our friends from Europe expect. If you are going to argue within this critical discussion framework, you pick a starting point and you stay with it till the very end.
Right.
In the rhetorical tradition, a starting point is provisional. it is a touchstone. And you're constantly searching for other touchstones, other starting points that you can then fold into your worldview. And so there are points, there are arguments that Wayne LaPierre advances that could be captured and brought into the realm of the arguments that Barack Obama raised. And there are some System 1 arguments that Wayne LaPierre uses that appeal to the emotion, but then when you vibrate them against System 2 reasoning, they evaporate, they become weak. And so the strategic maneuvering approach, to me, locks advocates into their starting points. And it does not allow for the intellectual and cognitive and rhetorical flexibility one needs to engage in human argumentation. And so, again, I wanted to talk about that because I thought that the conclusion of your article is important. I don't think that the strategic maneuvering framework is consistent with the conclusion. In fact, I see your conclusion refuting, empirically refuting, the strategic maneuvering model that you use in the beginning and the middle. And I say that to say, I want to be clear too that there are moments in which critical discussions like those are useful, but not in the argument that you charted, the one between Wayne LaPierre and Barack Obama.
Yeah, in that piece, we used the critical discussion is what enabled us to uncover that they both didn't accept each other's starting point. And then we're like, oh, if that's the problem, then they should just accept each other's starting point. So we used it more as a diagnostic, and less as a, this is what's wrong, and maybe we can then use it as prescribed. So we were abusing the critical discussion framework. So I know that if we had a serious pragmadialectician reviewer, they would have not been very pleased with what we were doing.
I don't know, because they would agree with the goal that you set forth in the article, which was to resolve a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
That's what it states in that system. You want to resolve the difference of opinion between Wayne LaPierre and Barack Obama, which is naive, which is counterproductive, and which is, I think, antithetical to a world of pluralism. So I would reject from the beginning the foundational assumption that our friends from that part of the world are using. They want to scaffold and put into a straitjacket argumentation, and that just, I don't think, is a way to liberate the creativity that we need to determine how we can live together. And that's why I liked the end of the article, because it said the way to encourage the best kinds of argumentation would be to have Barack Obama to enter into the worldview of Wayne LaPierre and to assume that maybe there's something reasonable about Wayne LaPierre's starting points. And even if Barack Obama didn't see much of reason in those starting points, there are some values in those starting points that Barack Obama would need to try to either co-opt or to capture and bring into his worldview. And therefore the creativity, the invention, rhetorical invention comes. And then there's the logic of persuasion, which is not strategic maneuvering. It is a moral activity that has a logic designed to honor the freedom and the autonomy of the audience that one is trying to persuade. And that's, again, another problem that I see in dividing or locating rhetoric in the realm of strategic maneuvering. Simply, what are the tactics that we're going to use to try to persuade the audience that we need to resolve our difference of opinion? I mean, it's wrong all along the way, except in really limited context, where if you're trying to build a bridge or maybe solve a math problem or something that's quite linear and structured, where rules have to become laws.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you right, one of the things I want to draw for the audience, because they're going to listen to Franz talk, is that in the framework of strategic maneuvering, and maybe I'll sign my article so they can see this discussion because it is a pretty jarring shift, right? Is strategic maneuvering only thinks of argument as accomplishing one thing, which is the resolution of differences, as compared to your framework, which is to indicate that it can do so many more things, like allowing the a polis or to accommodate multiple conflicting viewpoints without resolving those disagreements. And what you're saying you like about my essay is it starts with the assumption of Franz and ends with where you're at. So rather than attempting to be so modest as to resolve the gun debate, which is intractable, I end by saying that system didn't work. It just showed that they neither are going to accept it. So let's see if we can accommodate both sides.
Right. And again, we need to remain ecumenical because Franz does offer a model that is useful in certain very limited situations. But as a universal theory of argument, it really does fall prey to some assumptions that are not healthy or moral. And he dismisses the way that I view argumentation as moralistic. And I accept that criticism. I do begin with the assumption that argumentation is foundationally a moral activity. It's a humane activity, but it's also one that does embrace system one and system two thinking. And if you're building a bridge, maybe you should be using a critical discussion method. If you are engaged in a marital discussion argumentation, less so. If you're trying to build a civil society in which Jews can be Jews and also citizens of Belgium, then you need to, you can't force a decision. You should allow pluralism to reign. And I don't think that's really possible under the model that Franz is articulating.
Yeah, that makes sense because it locks you in. There's no stability.
Yeah, it says you must stay rooted to your starting point. That's the assumption. And the end point is a resolution of difference of opinion. And I think the assumption, the new rhetoric is you begin with a starting point that is provisional, and you are seeking for other starting points and other anchors that you can develop as you engage in an argument that unfolds over time. And the end goal of the argument is not a resolution of a disagreement, but a way of living together, given that we are all living in a world of pluralism, of value pluralism. And we can't force differences into one model or one way of looking at the world, which allow those differences to flourish.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had never considered the relationship between the critical discussion model and pluralism, but yeah, kind of when you have to adhere or it fails, that makes sense.
And what doesn't make sense to me either is it's neither pragmatic nor does it truly understand the history of dialectics, because pragmatism, at least in the American tradition with John Dewey, does understand that conflicts are not resolved, that we try to work through them, making use of our best intellectual and moral resources. And the dialectic should be one that entertains many different kinds of logics, not just one that is then scaffolded into these rules that must be followed. And if you don't follow those rules, then you have committed the foul of a fallacy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, this is great. Well, do you have any other advice you'd like to give to up-and-coming argumentation scholars?
I would say review your Perlman and Rectiteca, because I think it does provide a cosmopolitan view of argumentation that one can then use to study linguistics, pragmatics, philosophy, history. And it is not by its nature unfriendly to what Franz is doing. I think Franz is much more unfriendly to Perlman than Perlman would be to Franz. And that's unfortunate because there is value to that approach. And so I would encourage up and coming scholars to consider using the New Rhetoric Project as a launching point for the study of argumentation, rhetoric, and reason.
Excellent. Anything in particular you suggest they read?
Well, I would read Kenneth Burke. I'd read Hein Perlman. I would have a good command of Stephen Toulmin. And then I would also encourage them to read Robin Rowland and Michael Bartman's work and David Zarefsky. And so I would, again, encourage a very broad view of what constitutes the field of argumentation.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Great, Justin. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful moment.
It's been lovely. Cheers.
Take care, Justin.
Bye.